All right. Welcome back to another episode of Act Root to Fruit. My name is Marcel Tassara, and I'm on a quest to try and excavate the roots of the contextual behavioral sciences so that us non-congenital behaviorists can know what we're doing. And today I am thrilled to be speaking with Greg Madden about behaviorism and whatever else comes up. So far, we've kind of started out getting settled into the stance and what's unique about this technology, and had a discussion with Franz de Waal about evolution and our most recent relatives. And today we're getting going on this whole behaviorism topic, which is a scary one. Just to give you some backstory, the thing that I spoke with Joanne Steinwachs, and one of the things that I was thinking about was, when I started to learn ACT, I felt really good. It was just a communal experience, but to know what I'm really doing, I've had to go back and read the formulary of the medication, and it's not as fun. What do you think about that?
That's very true. It's there's an awful lot of pretty hardcore basic science, laboratory science. Awful lot of it is not written with a broad consumer in mind, very technical language.
Yeah.
Even I struggle to read it even after doing it for this many years.
Yeah. And so also a little bit of backstory. One of the first times I took Psych 101, mm-hmm. I wanted to make sure I got as much out of it as possible, so I took it a few times. And the folks who were teaching it were some graduate students. They were very, very hardcore behaviorists, and mm-hmm. They spent more time kind of dissing Freud than actually saying what he did, And it really turned me off to behaviorists.
Sure.
Put a really bad taste in my mouth. I think in part because I was like, well, I'm attracted to this field because I want to be helpful. I want to be of service. How, I don't know. It just didn't add up. And so that held me back from really embracing what behaviorism has to offer. I failed to thoroughly introduce you before I ask my follow-up question of what you just said. So Greg is a professor at Utah State University, and you are a professor in the behavioral analysis program.
That's correct.
And you study decision-making, impulsivity, and you're doing some work on how to teach people to delay gratification.
Yep, that's correct.
Health choices, and you've been you've served as multiple from editor-in-chief to associate editor of the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior.
That's correct.
And you are the editor-in-chief, or you were the editor-in-chief of a handbook, the APA Handbook of Behavioral Analysis.
That's correct.
So, so you're well steeped in this behavioral analytic world.
I've been doing it for a while.
Yeah. What is behavioral analysis?
Well, that's a good one. Behavior analysis is, if you talk to behavior analysts, they will say it's a natural scientific approach to the study of behavior.
Okay.
And I would agree with that. I think that behavior analysis is also the activity of the scientist who adheres to the philosophy of radical behaviorism as well.
Okay.
And so I think the early origins of radical behaviorism was really Watson's 1913 manifesto paper. I had cause recently to go back and read that 1913 paper. And interestingly, he doesn't reject the study of private events, of mental events and like that, which he's oftentimes accused of. instead he just says, why don't we put this on hold for a while?
Okay.
We just don't know enough to
Huh.
be studying this,
Yeah.
and so why don't we focus on objective behavior, and study that for several decades perhaps,
Hmm.
and see if it is that we can learn something about private behavior. And
And
his focus on feelings in the notorious Little Albert study. I mean, there you go. It's all about private behavior. It's just
mhm.
the public accompaniments of the fear response.
Yeah. So what made his approach to behaviorism radical?
Um, yeah, I think it is that the radical shift at that time was that everybody, or the main thing that had been happening in psychology is the focus was from behavior directed toward internal life. And so behavior was just studied, as a window through which we could deduce things about mental life and consciousness. People were really interested in consciousness. People were really interested in animal consciousness at the time. And so behavior was studied really just as, this is the only way we can get to what we're really interested in. What we're really interested in is mental life and consciousness. And again,
Okay.
Watson, I think, is saying, yeah, that's all cool stuff, man, but we're just not going to be able to do it
Hmm.
using the tools that we have available at this time.
And where do you see the field now?
Oh, it's much different now. Yeah, considerably different now. I mean, I think the shift, years later, when we could get to a position where we could begin to have this conversation about, well, maybe we should reintroduce the subjective, maybe we should reintroduce private events, thinking, feelings, etc., into a science of behavior. Then you get into the sort of the other aspect of radical behaviorism, and that's the aspect that's more associated with B.F. Skinner. And in that aspect, he reintroduces the idea, yeah, we really ought to be studying feelings and emotions and cognition as well, but we should be regarding these as behavioral phenomena. Um, and and so there, he's saying it's okay to study these kinds of things. Again, they're really interesting, and
Mhm.
obviously we all know these are really interesting phenomena. But what he's objecting to at his time was not so much that what people were doing was using behavior to study what's happening inside, but he was more objecting, it seems to me, to studying behavior and then looking for things inside as the explanation of what's happening on the outside. So the causal arrow kind of goes from inside to outside, and that was the part that Skinner was objecting to. So he's objecting to, um, yeah, cognitive phenomena as
Mhm.
the explanation of behavior. Yeah, I think what Skinner's saying is, look. In fact, I looked up the other day one of his famous quote on radical behaviorism. He said, It's the philosophy of a science of behavior, treated as a subject matter in its own right, apart from internal explanations, mental or physiological.
Mhm.
And so, what I think he's pointing to there is we should be trying to understand behavior. It's a really interesting subject matter in its own right. And when we're looking for the explanations of behavior, we should be looking at the level of behavior, not at some internal explanations. Um, so he has two categories of the internal explanations: the mental and the physiological.
Mhm.
The in that one, I mean, Skinner was not really a opponent to physiological explanations of behavior. He just thought that they were incomplete. And he
Okay.
oftentimes said that to have a complete science of behavior, we have to understand the physiology of the individual and how it interacts with behavior and the environment to give us a complete picture. And
Okay.
then the mental part, I think he's really objecting to a particular kind of explanation, and it's the mentalistic kinds of explanations. the folk psychology kinds of
Mm-hmm.
explanations. And those are the kinds of explanations that, I deal with on a regular basis because I teach undergraduates on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And unlike, a student who's taking an introductory course in physics, they don't have a folk physics that they
Yeah,
walk
that's
into the
true.
class
That's
with.
true.
I have a very strong sense that they already understand this phenomena, that this, professor is now going to talk to me about his crazy theories. Instead, they just assume that the physicists have it all down because, well, they put them in on the moon, by
Mm-hmm.
golly, and so they must have
Mm-hmm.
some kinds of explanations down correctly here. And so, yeah, I have to work against this idea of there are mental causes of the behavior that you engage in. And so I think I read this years ago when Steve Hayes talked about this. One of his arguments against these kinds of mentalistic explanations of behavior is that, when you point to these mental events as causal, you don't realize that this mental event is actually, it's the activity of an organism, and therefore it's classified as behavior. And
Mm-hmm.
so you've just explained behavior A by pointing to behavior B,
Oh.
but you never bother to ask the question, what caused behavior B?
Uh-huh.
Was it behavior C? Well, then what caused behavior C? And then
Mm-hmm.
it's just this infinite regress where you get no closer to being able to actually explain the behavior.
Yeah.
And likewise, when the other one that's very common among students is that they believe um, that the mental event that causes their behavior is their choice. And
Mm.
so they regard choice as a different kind of phenomena, when from a behavioral perspective, choice is behavior.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the upcoming textbook that I'm working on, which is nearly done, that I mentioned briefly before
Yeah.
we went on
Intro
air here.
intro to
Yeah,
behavioral analysis.
Introduction to Behavior Analysis.
Mm-hmm.
There's an entire chapter devoted to the study of choice. It's a very advanced quantitative science at this point, and so pointing to choice as the real cause of my overt behaviors just makes absolutely no sense, because once again, you've tried to explain behavior A
Mm-hmm.
by pointing to behavior B, which is the choice behavior. But what caused the choice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And it's makes me just kind of think about the semantics that we get tripped up on a lot. You
Mm-hmm.
know, the question I have in relationship to this is, a lot of us who are enamored with ACT, I think mindfulness is a hot topic right now, and also just the techniques that are taught in ACT are really attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Of these, I'm wondering what's important, do you think, for those of us who are coming to ACT without much of a behavioral background? What's important about behavioral analysis that we should know? And not that you're going to teach us all that in this answer, but maybe help point, please.
Yeah. Um, it's hard to say. It's
It's a big
just such a
question.
massive
Yeah,
field.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if I, let's, what are the tools that clinicians use in their practice that
Yeah.
seem behavioral? So, like exposure
Mm-hmm.
components
Mm-hmm.
of therapy. So, from that perspective, exposure components of therapy is really a Pavlovian technique.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if it is that the individual therapist doesn't really understand Pavlovian conditioning, other than I know it has something to do with Pavlov's dog, then there's probably a pretty good chance you're not going to be as effective as you could be
Mm-hmm.
if you really understood Pavlovian conditioning. And generally speaking, I find that most people I talk to, even within behavior analysis, frankly, don't really understand Pavlovian conditioning all that well. Within behavior analysis, it's not, because Skinner was so operant focused.
Mm-hmm.
Most behavior analysts spend most of their time studying operant conditioning processes.
Yeah.
And most people who work in applied behavior analysis, they really work with operant behavior. And so that's kind of what they know, and they know operant conditioning techniques.
To understand some of the terminology and
Hmm.
around behavioral analysis, one
Sure.
of the words that I'd like to hear you talk about within this, if possible, is contingencies.
Sure. Yeah, contingencies are fairly simple idea. It's the idea that if you engage in the behavior, this is the simplest contingency.
Okay.
If if you engage in the behavior, then there will be a consequence. So if we
Okay.
stick with reinforcers,
Hmm.
if you press this button, then you will receive 5 cents. If you press the button more frequently, then I can say that I arranged this reinforcement contingency. They press the button more frequently than they did without the 5 cent reward. And because the rate of pressing the button went up,
Hmm.
we would classify the consequence as a reinforcer. There are much more complicated contingencies than that.
Hmm.
And so here's a slightly more complicated one. If I make you press the button twice, now I'd have a fixed ratio 2 contingency in operation
Hmm.
on the button. I could do a time-based contingency. So the first button press after 30 seconds is the one that's reinforced. There's just lots of, you can come up with as many contingencies as you have an imagination
Hmm.
to create different contingencies. Forster and Skinner, in their 1957 book called Schedules of Reinforcement, they should have called that book Contingencies of Reinforcement,
Okay.
because it just lays out every possible contingency of reinforcement that they could think of at that time.
Hmm.
And they outlined all the orderly patterns of behavior that they observed in non-humans when they laid those or put those contingencies in place.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Is that still relevant today? That book? Would you send people there?
no,
No.
definitely not.
Okay.
I mean, let me preface that
If they have
that
insomnia, maybe if then.
that's it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the most boring book you're
Yeah.
ever going to not read. I don't know
Okay.
anybody who's ever read it, because it wasn't written in a way that anybody would want to read. It's more of a reference book.
Where do you send your students to immerse themselves in this contingency talk?
Well, right now, the students who are in my intro class, I give them preprints of the textbook that I'm working
Okay.
on.
Okay.
And so we talk about contingencies in the very first chapter, where we talk about reinforcement, because in order to talk about reinforcement, you really have to talk about a
Hmm.
contingency
Hmm.
between behavior and the reinforcing consequence. And then eventually, once they understand reinforcement and the different sorts of reinforcers that can exist, primary reinforcers, conditioned reinforcers, negative reinforcers, then we're in a position where we can start talking about more complex contingencies of reinforcement. And
Hmm.
then we talk about some of the very basic but more complex contingencies of reinforcement. One of the interesting things that I have always loved about contingencies of reinforcement is, as I said before, it's not like there's a set of contingencies of reinforcement. They can be made up on the spot. And so, like, for example, the contingency of reinforcement with drug self-administration. So this is research where the animal presses a lever if they want to obtain a drug reinforcer. If they do, then they consume drugs, much like humans do.
Hmm.
And so,
Are you talking about Facebook?
yeah, that would be a variable ratio sexual reinforcement, the most addictive of them
Wow.
all.
You think they have some behaviorists working for them?
I'm pretty sure
If
they
you one or two.
do. Yeah, I don't know any of them, but
Hmm. Would you liken it to learning a new language? Kind of.
oh, learning about behavior analysis.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
behaviorism.
unfortunately, there is a technical language that you do have to pick up along the way
Hmm.
in order for you to read the literature of behavior analysis. Yeah, you're going to have to learn the the core language, the core technological language of behavior analysis. It is an impediment to people trying to go in and learn a little bit, to be sure. And yeah, again, not to plug a book that doesn't exist yet,
Yeah.
but too much anyways. But yeah, that's one of the things we try to do in this book, is to try to, speak to an audience that doesn't know anything about behavior analysis, but is
Hmm.
interested in behavior, because behavior, frankly, is really an interesting subject matter in its own right, to
Yeah.
use the radical behaviorist phraseology. I mean, you think about the cause of death in the United States and worldwide, and the number one killers in the U.S. are cigarette smoking and obesity and inactivity. And when you think about the problems of the world, and I mean, they all almost boil down to behavior.
Hmm.
Global warming, that's behavior.
Yeah.
You want to fix that, you got to get people to change their behavior. You need
Not,
the technology of behavior change
yeah.
to do that. And so focusing on behavior is, it should be incredibly relevant
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah. I'm with you. So
Yeah.
on that note, focusing on
Yeah.
behavior, I'm wondering if we could do a little bit of a behavior analysis example.
Sure.
I wonder if you could just talk about like something as innocuous as deciding to be on this podcast, or what shirt, why you chose that shirt this morning, and you could kind of, you know, look at it through a
What
behavior
is up
analytic.
with that shirt?
Actually, that's the whole reason you're on. Mike Tuig has been concerned about this shirt for a while, and he's been wanting me to have this intervention with you. Something in kind of innocuous, potentially, just so
Uh-huh.
to kind of help myself and the listeners understand what it means to do kind of analysis of a behavior.
Okay. Um, well, let's choose something more significant than the shirt.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've tried to do, as I especially, well, I try to stay in fairly good shape,
Hmm.
but I try to do it in a way that I don't have to sweat.
Okay.
Because I recognize that if I have to sweat, um, I'm going to be less likely to want to exercise again, because it means I need to take a second shower
Hmm.
for the day.
Hmm.
So when I first started trying to get into shape years and years ago, I did a lot of riding of my bike, and I would ride my bike to work, and that all seemed good. But I noticed that um, I didn't do it as much on hot days, because I didn't want to have to take a second shower.
Okay.
So, and so I've just looked for ways to increase the probability that I will engage in physical exercise, but do it in a way that I don't actually work up a sweat.
Okay.
Okay, so one way in which I have done this is that I have this little app on my phone, and um, it goes off every 40 minutes. So I have a salient stimulus
Okay.
that signals to me that, it's a reminder that you should engage in this behavior. And so it reconnects me with the goal that I have in
Every
mind
40 minutes, you said.
every 40 minutes.
Hmm.
And then what I do is I get up from my desk, because there's research on this that shows that if you get up
Hmm.
from a sitting position for after about 40 minutes and do a little something, then it's much better for you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
I heard someone say recently that sitting is the new smoking.
that's right. That's exactly
I
right.
love that. I love that saying.
Yeah. So when that goes off and I make sure it's loud and annoying,
Hmm.
then I get up, and I've got a little exercise ball in my office, and I do a round of sit-ups, or I have some weights in the room and I do one round of lifting weights. Or
Okay.
when I was in my office at the university, I would do 3 flights of stairs in the building, just something simple,
Hmm.
but it's nothing that I would ever work up a sweat
Okay.
doing. And
Okay.
yet I'm able to maintain my core strength and
Hmm.
you know, I'm not going to be a bodybuilder or anything like that with this,
Hmm.
obviously, but nor do I want to be. I just want to stay healthy as I get older and older. And then with the bike riding to work, it was producing too much sweating. And so I, um, got rid of that and just walked to work at that point. And so I'm trying to find, so in this behavioral analysis, I'm trying to find ways to reduce the aversive consequences
Okay.
of engaging in this behavior that I need to engage in. Okay. And
Yeah.
so what is the main aversive? I don't like taking 2 showers a
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
I don't like the sweat like that and be
Uh-huh.
stinky. And so I just figured out, can I find behaviors that I can do that are short duration behaviors or not so, I'm not running or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so according to my Fitbit, I average about 40 miles of walking every week.
Mm.
And I do these exercises every 40 minutes in my office. And so by reducing the aversiveness of a goal directed behavior that I really want to engage in, I'm able to do it much more than I would had I tried it, by working out at the gym, running, riding the bike, things like that.
Okay. There's a gap between what's being done in behavior analysis and what's being done in the therapy office. And
Hmm.
I'm not understanding that gap.
Yeah. So you detect that there is a gap.
Yeah.
I detect that there is a gap as well.
Yeah.
Um, but where would you where would you like to see the gap close? Because when I look at what's going on in the ACT therapy world, and
Hmm.
I'm far from an expert, but I did take Mike Tuick's class.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I'm impressed with the things that people are doing in the ACT therapy literature.
Uh-huh.
And so, if they had a better understanding of behavioral contingencies, could they do it better? I think that's probably the case, but I don't know that I have enough expertise in ACT therapy to know where would it be useful to know more about
Okay.
reinforcement contingencies.
Okay.
If I had to point to one, just to go back to the um, shaping and percentile schedules,
Hmm.
I mean, if it is that you're trying to gradually help an individual to acquire a new habit or get into the habit of doing something every day, then yeah, I think knowing something about the habit formation literature, knowing something about shaping
Hmm.
might be a useful set of skills to inter- introduce into the therapy and evaluate if in fact it is useful or not.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so you could see the extension of the of behavior analysis in the class and the in the ACT work that you're familiar with.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's one example of, just off the top of my head that might be useful.
Okay.
I'm sure, if I had more time to think about it, I'm sure
Yeah.
I could come up with
Yeah.
more. But Steve, he was he was schooled in all of this behavior analysis stuff
Hmm.
from the start,
Hmm.
and he was a major contributor to the behavior analysis literature as well. I mean, his work in the area of human performances under schedules of reinforcement and changing contingencies of reinforcement, that stuff was super important um, in the time, but I think it was also super important in the development of ACT, because I think what Steve saw the humans were doing in the laboratory conditions, which is to say they were following a bunch of rules that didn't mesh very well with the environments in which they were, trying to earn reinforcers.
Hmm.
And yet they adhered to these rules religiously
Yeah.
and weren't sensitive to changing contingencies. I think that was had a real impact on Steve, because he saw that in his therapy work
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
These people show up, they have these rigid set of rules that limit their flexibility, that they won't deviate from the rules, and they don't really see that they're rule following. They're just taking it all so literally. And so, yeah, I think that probably played some role in the development of the directions that ACT therapy went.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you for that. That's really helpful to hear.
Hmm.
For someone like myself, you've heard me talking about
Hmm.
and get a sense of my understanding of behaviorism. Where with what's available now, it's
Hmm.
published now. Where do you send me to get? Where do you send me to get kind of better steeped in the behavioral analytic radical behavioral world?
Yeah, I think I would look for an introductory textbook. in
Okay.
behavior analysis. I listened to the podcast that you did with Joanne the other day,
Yeah.
and I enjoyed that.
Thank
And
you.
she mentioned that that somebody told her to read Catania's book
Yeah. Steve.
early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve told her that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And I love Charlie Catania, but that book is a real difficult one to read. I have read it, and I have considered it for my class, but I just don't want to do that to my introductory students because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
really a difficult book. And then she mentioned what I think the book that she was talking about was the Principles of Everyday Behavior
Mm-hmm.
Analysis, which was
Mm-hmm.
a book by L. Keith Miller.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, the book has been out of print for quite a few years, and it's
Okay.
certainly a dated book.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could find it as a used book on
Yeah.
Amazon or someplace like this, it is a good place to start because it goes over the core principles,
Mm-hmm.
and it does it in a way that's very simple to follow. And you can go through a chapter in about 20 minutes, and there's like 24 chapters in the book.
Okay.
So it's a pretty quick read.
Oh.
And you'll understand it. Plus, there's tons. The book was just filled with fill-in-the-blank questions with
Okay.
answers at the back of the book, so to give yourself a assessment of whether you're understanding it or not. From there, I would look for a more contemporary book, and yeah, maybe my book will be ready by
Okay.
then.
Sounds good.
Because
Yeah.
because that book it's dated.
Yeah.
For sure. There's a lot of
Yeah.
things in there that are just not up to date, and there's no coverage of Pavlovian conditioning at all in that textbook. But
Okay.
again, I think that's a pretty important one for clinicians to understand
All right.
Pavlovian conditioning well. And the understanding of Pavlovian conditioning really has changed a lot over the last 30 years. So important to understand the most recent understandings of Pavlovian conditioning.
Okay. Would you
Yeah.
consider a subtitle for your book as putting sexy back in behaviorism?
We certainly try.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's very little talk of the traditional areas of focus of behavior analysis. A little bit of talk about autism and developmental disabilities, but
Uh-huh.
that's not the typical stuff that excites the undergraduate right out of the box.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they want to know is, why do I do these things, and why do all my friends do these things?
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about real world behavior. There's sections in there about terrorism and white nationalism and substance abuse and just all kinds of things like that
Great.
are real world problems that people are interested in solving.
Yeah. Beautiful. Who's publishing that?
Yeah, Wiley Blackwell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I will. Well, as soon as that gets published, I'll add that to the show notes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
And
Yeah.
really appreciate the discussion, Greg, and your time.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it.
I'm off to my next guide.
All right.
Trudge through the forest here of behaviorism.
Good luck.
Thank you.
A good journey.
Thank you.
But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me. But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me. But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me.